Welcome to the Tech Loft podcast, Ep.9, the Atari 7800 versus the Nintendo Entertainment System. Before we get started, make sure you hit that subscribe button on Spotify and YouTube so you never miss an episode.
Definitely do that.
Today, we're going back in time.
Back in time.
To a classic console war. The Atari 7800 versus the NES.
Oh, yeah.
But buckle up for a trip down memory lane.
I am buckled.
To really appreciate this showdown, let's start by breaking down the tech specs of each machine. I have my notes here, and there's some interesting details that might surprise you.
Okay.
First up, the Atari 7800.
All right.
Released in 1984.
Before the NES.
Bit of a trailblazer coming out before the NES.
Yeah.
You can already see the differences in design philosophy if you compare the specs side by side.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this. Atari went with a 2-button controller,
Right.
which was pretty standard at the time, and the games topped out at a size of 144K.
Tiny.
That's tiny by today's standards. You couldn't even fit a high-res photo on that.
Oh, absolutely not.
But back then, that was cutting-edge stuff. Now, here's where things get interesting.
Okay.
The Atari 7800 had a screen resolution of 320 by 200 pixels
Right.
and could display 25 colors simultaneously from a palette of 256.
Wow.
On paper, that's impressive.
Yeah.
Especially when you compare it to the NES, which came out a year later with a resolution of 256 by 240 and only 13 simultaneous colors out of 52.
Oh, interesting.
But here's the catch. Many Atari 7800 games actually used a resolution of 160 by 200,
Uh-huh.
which resulted in those black bars on the sides of the screen.
Yes.
Kind of like watching an old movie on a widescreen TV.
Right.
And that, my friend, brings us to a fascinating point. While the Atari, on paper, boasted more colors and higher resolution in some cases, the NES often ended up looking better.
How is that possible?
It likely comes down to a few things. First, the NES's color palette, though smaller, was expertly chosen. Think about those vibrant greens and blues of the Mushroom Kingdom.
Okay.
Instantly recognizable. Second, Nintendo really knew how to squeeze every ounce of performance out of the NES hardware.
That's right.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And let's not forget the NES's secret weapon, those innovative memory management chips.
Ah, yes. The MMCs.
Yes, the MMCs.
This was a stroke of genius from Nintendo. Those chips allowed NES cartridges to be much larger,
Okay.
up to 640K, which is more than 4 times the size of Atari games.
Wow.
That size difference had a huge impact on the games, right?
Absolutely. Think of all the sprawling worlds and detailed levels you see in games like Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda. That level of complexity just wasn't possible on the Atari 7800 with its limited cartridge size. Plus, the MMCs enabled features like extra RAM for more complex calculations, save game batteries, and other cool things.
Right.
Okay, so the NES was already flexing its muscles in terms of what its technology could do.
Uh-huh.
But let's not forget about the controllers. The NES introduced the iconic D-pad, which revolutionized game controls.
The D-pad was a game changer. Literally. It offered much more precise control compared to the Atari's joystick. I'm sure your thumbs still remember countless hours mastering that D-pad.
You're telling me, okay, so we've got a good understanding of the technical differences between these two consoles.
Okay.
But let's get to the heart of it, the games. Did you know that some of the most popular Nintendo games actually came out on the Atari 7800?
I did. It's almost like Atari was trying to play catch-up. Games like Donkey Kong and Mario Bros. Were released on the Atari years after they were already huge hits on the NES.
It makes you wonder what could have been if the 7800 had really taken off.
Definitely. It's a big what-if in gaming history.
All right, let's jump into some head-to-head game comparisons. This is where we see how those technical differences played out in the actual gaming experience.
Okay.
First up, Choplifter.
Now, remember, there was actually a Famicom version. That's the Japanese predecessor to the NES, but it didn't make it to the US.
Oh.
And honestly, maybe that was for the best.
Tell me more.
The Famicom version, while visually closer to the original arcade game, was notoriously difficult. Almost to the point of being unfair. There was this one part, after rescuing hostages, where you had a tiny window to escape before a tank blasted you.
Oh, wow.
Almost impossible.
That sounds frustrating.
Incredibly. The Atari version, on the other hand, while not as graphically impressive, gave you a fighting chance.
Okay.
So for pure enjoyment, I think the Atari version takes round 1.
Interesting. An early win for the underdog. Let's move on to Commando, another classic arcade title.
This one really highlights how technical limitations can impact the gaming experience. The NES version of Commando suffered from terrible sprite flicker. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah.
It's when the characters on screen seem to shimmer and shake because the hardware can't keep up.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. It was especially noticeable in games with lots of action on the screen.
Exactly. The Atari 7800, with its simpler graphics and emphasis on speed, didn't have this issue. So if I had to pick between the two versions of Commando, it would be the Atari 7800 all the way. No flicker, thank you very much.
2 for Atari so far.
Hmm.
Is Nintendo going to make a comeback?
We'll have to see. Let's move on to our next game.
Sounds good. What's next on the list?
Next up is Donkey Kong, which is interesting because it was originally a Nintendo arcade game.
Yeah, it's almost like Atari was trying to challenge Nintendo on its own turf by releasing Donkey Kong on the 7800.
Right, but you have to wonder if they had looked at the NES version first. They might have reconsidered. The NES version of Donkey Kong was a masterpiece, incredibly faithful to the arcade original. In fact, it was so good that Nintendo didn't even bother releasing a standalone arcade version on their own virtual console service until 2018.
Wow. That says a lot. But how did the Atari version stack up?
Well, the Atari version, while decent in screenshots, had some serious gameplay issues. The jump mechanics were completely off, making it feel more like Jungle Hunt than Donkey Kong.
Really?
It just wasn't a fun experience.
So a clear win for Nintendo there. What about Donkey Kong Jr.? Did Atari fare any better with the sequel?
Unfortunately, no. The Atari version of Donkey Kong Jr. suffered from similar problems. It was a far cry from the classic NES version, which was a near-perfect port of the arcade game. In fact, some people even had trouble getting past the second level in the Atari version because of the clunky controls and odd game physics.
Oof. Okay, so Nintendo is pulling ahead in this console war. Let's move on to Double Dragon, another arcade classic that made its way to both the Atari 7800 and the NES.
Double Dragon is a great example of how those memory management chips on the NES really made a difference. The NES version, while different from the arcade, was still a solid and enjoyable beat-em-up experience.
And I remember spending countless hours playing Double Dragon with my friends. It was a blast.
It was. The Atari 7800 version, however, was a major letdown. The limited hardware just couldn't handle the complexity of the game, resulting in a disappointing experience.
It seems like a recurring theme. Atari was ambitious in trying to port these arcade hits to the 7800, but the hardware often held them back.
That's a great observation. It's fascinating to see how those technical limitations influence the final product.
All right, let's see what happens with another Nintendo classic, Mario Bros. You mentioned earlier that some Nintendo games made their way to the Atari 7800, and this is another prime example.
This one is a head-scratcher, for sure. Atari released Mario Bros. On a 7800 in 1988, years after it was a launch title on the NES.
Yeah. You'd think they would have realized that anyone who wanted to play Mario Bros. Already had the superior version on the NES.
Right. It's like they were trying to convince Nintendo fans to switch consoles by offering them a familiar face. But the truth is, the Atari version just couldn't compete.
So another point for Nintendo. Let's switch gears to Mrs. Pac-Man. This one is interesting because there were actually 2 versions of the game released on the NES.
That's right. There was an unlicensed version by a company called Tengen, which was known for pushing the boundaries of what was allowed on Nintendo's platform.
Oh, I remember Tengen. They were always trying to get around Nintendo's strict licensing rules.
Exactly. Their version of Miss Pac-Man, while very similar to ports on other systems, had this weird issue with scrolling mazes that were basically death traps. You could easily run into a ghost that you couldn't see coming.
Oh, no.
And then there was the officially licensed version from Namco, the original creators of Pac-Man. Their version, unfortunately, felt slow and sluggish compared to the arcade original.
This is like a disappointing experience for Pac-Man fans. Where does the Atari 7800 version fit into all of this?
The Atari 7800 version of Mrs. Pac-Man was actually the best of the bunch. It was fast, fun, and captured the spirit of the arcade game perfectly. The graphics were a bit off, but the core gameplay was spot on.
Wow, a surprise win for the Atari 7800.
It just goes to show that sometimes, even with limited hardware, developers can find a way to make a truly great game.
All right, we're getting close to the end of our list of games. What's next?
Let's take a look at Xenophobe.
Okay.
It was a fun little alien knockoff with some unique gameplay elements. Both the Atari and NES versions were fairly faithful to the arcade, but the NES version had a slight edge in terms of visuals and overall polish.
I'm starting to see a pattern here. Atari often prioritized speed and responsiveness, while Nintendo focused on pushing the visual boundaries of what the NES could do.
That's a great point. It really reflects the different design philosophies of the two companies. Atari, with its arcade heritage, was all about that fast-paced adrenaline-pumping experience. Nintendo, on the other hand, was more focused on creating immersive worlds and beautiful graphics.
Makes sense. Both approaches have their merits. It's just a matter of personal preference in the end.
Exactly. And let's not forget, we're only looking at a small selection of games here. If you factor in all the games that were released exclusively on the Atari 7800, the playing field might look a little different.
That's true. There were some hidden gems on the Atari 7800 that never made it to the NES.
Exactly. And if we were to focus solely on arcade ports, the Atari 7800 was no slouch. It had some really impressive conversions that captured the arcade experience beautifully.
So while the NES ultimately won the console war in terms of sales and popularity, the Atari 7800 deserves credit for its technical achievements and dedication to arcade-perfect ports.
Absolutely. It was a powerful machine for its time, and it had a dedicated following of gamers who appreciated its unique strengths.
Yeah, it's been fascinating to revisit this classic console war and see how these two gaming titans approach things differently. Both the Atari 7800 and the NES had their strengths and weaknesses, their unique quirks and charm.
Yeah. And it's a reminder that innovation comes in many forms.
Yeah.
Atari pushed the boundaries of speed and arcade-perfect ports, while Nintendo innovated with things like memory management chips and a focus on creating immersive worlds.
And ultimately, it was the games themselves that captivated us, regardless of the hardware they ran on. Whether you were exploring Hyrule on your NES, battling ninjas in Double Dragon, or munching dots with Mrs. Pac-Man, these games created lasting memories and sparked a lifelong passion for gaming for many of us.
It's amazing how those classic games still hold up today.
Yeah.
There's a timeless quality to them that transcends generations.
Speaking of timeless qualities, one thing that has stuck with me throughout this discussion is how those innovative memory management chips really gave the NES an edge. Imagine if Atari had adopted a similar approach.
That's a fascinating thought. What if Atari had found a way to push the boundaries of what their cartridges could do? Could they have created even more impressive games and closed the gap with the NES?
It's impossible to say for sure, but it's fun to speculate.
Yeah.
Maybe with more development time and a focus on pushing the hardware further, the Atari 7800 could have been an even stronger contender in the console wars.
It's like a choose-your-own-adventure for gaming history. We can only imagine what might have been.
But even though the NES ultimately emerged victorious, we can appreciate the Atari 7800 for what it was. A powerful machine with a unique character and a library of fantastic games.
Well said. It's a testament to the creativity and ingenuity of the developers who worked on both systems.
This has been an awesome trip down memory lane. Before we wrap up, I want to remind everyone to subscribe to the Tech Loft podcast on Spotify and YouTube so you don't miss our next episode.
And be sure to visit our website, thetechloft.com, for more in-depth articles, discussions, and all sorts of tech goodness.
Thank you so much for joining us on this journey through the epic battle of the Atari 7800 versus the Nintendo Entertainment System. It's been a blast revisiting these classic consoles and the games that defined a generation. Until next time, keep on gaming.